Homosexuality, the act of two people of the same sex participating in a romantic or sexual relationship. For the purposes of this video, I will be referring to homosexuals as anyone that engages in homosexual activity, including bisexuals, and I'll make the distinction where necessary. In most of modern Western Europe, North America, and Australasia, homosexuality is very much seen as a good thing, something normal and healthy to be celebrated. This message is promoted heavily throughout films, television, games, through schools and universities, large corporations, the government, and so on. Going against the orthodox message of homosexuality in these parts of the world is very much seen as taboo and socially unacceptable, and these same outlets also teach that such a viewpoint is evil. As a matter of fact, in many of these nations, adopting and expressing an anti-homosexual viewpoint is illegal, with there being countless examples of people getting arrested simply for expressing anti-homosexual viewpoints. As a result of all of this, views on homosexuality are mostly positive. However, there is a minority of people in these nations that do not hold this view. This is typically seen as a position older people are more likely to hold, as it's only recently in Western history that homosexuality has become accepted. Globally, however, this is not the case, as many parts of Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and so on are on the whole not so accepting of homosexuality. Many people in Western nations will likely have little to no exposure to the actual reasons why people may have alternative views on this subject. So in this video, I hope to shed some light on this and present the reasons for why people hold such beliefs. Please remember to watch to the end of the video before casting your judgment and writing your comments. And with that being said, please enjoy the video. We evolve certain traits and characteristics based on what allows us to survive and reproduce, thus passing on our genes. For example, someone born with a genetic mutation that causes them to develop a health condition, with that genetic mutation providing no other benefit, will be less likely to survive and reproduce. Therefore, the genes responsible for the poor genetic health of that person will not be passed down. Alternatively, you may have someone born with a genetic mutation that gives them greater eyesight or stamina or some other advantage that allows that person to succeed more than others in surviving and later reproducing, so those genes will be passed down to future generations. Sexual attraction is one such example of a trait we developed through evolution. We evolved sexual desires and such a compulsion to have sex because sex results in childbirth and your genes being passed down. If you didn't feel any such desire, then you would have no reason to have sex, and your lack of genes for feeling any kind of sexual impulse would not get passed down. Meanwhile, the people that feel very strongly about having lots of sex will be more likely to pass down those genes that give them such a strong compulsion. Disgust is another trait we evolved through evolution. Things like mold, feces, or decomposing food, for example, are likely to make us ill or have some other negative consequence, and disgust causes us to avoid those things. People that experience feelings of disgust are therefore more likely to survive, since they are less likely to get sick or whatever from interacting or doing things that can bring harm. People that don't feel disgust are more likely to then be harmed by disgusting things. A modern example of this is with COVID. People who are more sensitive to feelings of disgust were more likely to fare better during the pandemic, as they would be more likely to do things like wash their hands. We also feel disgust when it comes to certain sexual activities as well, ones which are either harmful, result in poor offspring, or are a waste of time due to not resulting in offspring. Necrophilia, corpophilia, and bestiality are three such examples, since these do not result in childbirth and are also likely to give you diseases. Incest is another example, with it having a higher likelihood of the child having health disorders. We evolved to feel disgusted by such acts because by being adverse to these sexually abnormal activities, we are less likely to waste our time in sexual activities that have no chance of producing viable offspring, and we're less likely to bring harm to ourselves and others with things like disease, psychological damage to victims within your community or tribe from such acts, and so on. Such acts are rightfully so deemed unacceptable by wider society because it's simply natural for us to be inherently adverse to such behaviour. This brings us at last to homosexuality, which, if you consider other sexually abnormal behaviour we've evolved to be disgusted by, it's easy to see how it fits in. Obviously, homosexuals are unable to have children, so someone that does not get their sexual relief from having sex with members of the opposite sex would not then have any children, and the whole reason we evolved to feel sexual attraction is that it leads to procreation. People that are not just mildly disinterested but actively disgusted by homosexuality would be less likely to be homosexual and not reproduce compared to those who may not carry this active aversion. Therefore, their genes would proliferate in the long run. And indeed, studies have shown that in healthy heterosexual men, the physiological stress response to seeing two men kissing is the same as seeing maggots and rotting flesh, and this does not change even for those with highly favourable and progressive views on homosexuality. Now, despite what pro-homosexuality advocates often claim, there are negative factors associated with them outside of the simple and obvious you can't reproduce. They have a much higher risk of having poorer health and getting diseases, which provides another evolutionary explanation as to why we would be averse to homosexuality. But what exactly are these health risks? Let's now take a closer look at the next chapter of this video. First, let's get into the physical health side of things. STDs, and particularly HIV and AIDS, are the most notorious when it comes to this aspect. According to the CDC, in 2021, 67% of new HIV cases in the United States were by homosexual men. The CDC also estimates that 1 in 6 homosexual men will at some point get infected with HIV, compared to 1 in 524 for heterosexual men and 1 in 253 for heterosexual women. And this is just one type of STD. There are numerous others like syphilis, for example, of which 63% of cases in 2021 were among homosexual men, or gonorrhea, where 40% of the cases occurred amongst homosexual men. Cancer is another major risk for homosexuals, particularly vaginal, anal, and throat cancer. These are most commonly caused by HPV, an STI which can also result in genital warts, as well as sometimes HIV. About 75% of vaginal cancer, 70% of oropharyngeal cancer, and 91% of anal cancer are a result of HPV. HIV-negative homosexuals are 20 times more likely to be diagnosed with anal cancer, and HIV-positive ones are 40 times more likely. As for oral and vaginal cancers, there are similarly much higher levels of risk when compared to heterosexuals, although not as severe a degree as for anal sex. These statistics are especially crazy when you consider that only 2 to 4% of the US population is comprised of homosexuals. Other studies have shown homosexuals also tend to have far worse health in many other aspects of life, such as engaging in high rates of alcoholism, smoking, and drug use. But it doesn't end there, as various studies have shown that the mental health of homosexuals does not fare much better. A 2008 meta-analysis stated that homosexuals have a higher risk for depression and anxiety disorders, alcohol and other substance dependencies, and suicide attempts. The results were mostly the same for both male and female homosexuals, with female homosexuals having a higher risk for substance dependencies and male homosexuals having a higher risk for attempting suicide. In 2010, a twin study in Sweden stated rates of depression, generalized anxiety disorder, eating disorders, alcohol dependence, and ADHD were increased amongst men and women with same-sex sexual experiences. And other studies have shown homosexuals to have an increased rate of bipolar disease, obsessive compulsive disorders, phobias, certain personality disorders, as well as psychotic symptoms and psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia. All of this as well adds up to billions in the cost of treatment and research for the rest of us. For example, the total US federal funding for HIV alone in 2022 was $47 billion. There is a plethora of further studies and statistics that you can research for yourself, but for now I think I've made my point that homosexuality is definitely associated with having worse health. But what exactly causes this? Pro-homosexual advocates will argue that the stress caused by discrimination and prejudice is to blame for much of this, especially with regards to the mental health side of things. This is known as the minority stress theory. However, the evidence for this is very poor. If it is indeed a factor at all, then it's only a very partial one. Stigma against homosexuals has drastically decreased in Western nations for the past few decades, yet the massive gap between hetero and homosexual health still persists. For further reading of this, please check my list of sources for 2 articles that cover this topic. Much of the subculture associated with homosexuality revolves around bars and clubs catered towards them and the extreme levels of promiscuity that follows. This is an obvious explanation for the enormous rates of STDs, and STDs can lead to other health consequences such as various forms of cancers, as discussed previously. Having to live with STDs that resulted from you living such an indecent lifestyle would no doubt lead to stress and overall poorer mental health. Drug use is also heavily associated with visiting bars and clubs, which would also contribute to the poorer health levels, both physically and mentally. Many homosexuals were also abused in childhood or had divorced parents, amongst various other negative circumstances in life. In these instances, the conditions which caused them to become a homosexual may have also had other adverse effects on their mental well-being, making homosexuality more like a symptom of a more general developmental disorder rather than the cause itself. And don't worry, we'll come back to this later in the video. Finally, the sexual confusion itself of going against a billion years of evolution, of not having a natural healthy relationship, may be inherently psychologically stressful in of itself. This is much in the same way that, say, living a life of social isolation can lead to stress, depression, and other negative psychological consequences, as humans evolve to be social animals that interact and cooperate with other humans. I believe this is demonstrated in their lack of relationship stability. Homosexuals separate and get divorced at increased rates compared to that of heterosexuals, as well as the higher rates of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking compared to heterosexuals. Paraphilias in general are environmental and develop through your experience and conditioning through life, rather than being caused by genetic factors. I hardly think that the people who can only get off to Sonic the Hedgehog vor inflation cartoons are born that way. But are homosexuals born with their sexuality? Is it something inherent to them, or is it environmental, like with paraphilias? If the former were the case, then it can be argued that since a certain subset of the population will always be homosexual, then there is simply nothing you can do about it, and you might as well accept them for who they are, since non-acceptance isn't going to get them to change their sexual orientation. However, the evidence indicates that it is not hardwired, not genetic, and that sexuality is malleable. Studies have repeatedly shown that people's sexuality does change. For adults, half of those who are exclusive homosexuals were once bisexual or even heterosexual, and a roughly equal number changed from being exclusively homosexual to bisexual or exclusively heterosexual. Homosexuality is far more fluid than heterosexuality based on the much higher proportion of homosexuals who will change their sexual orientation towards heterosexuality, about half, compared to the 3% of heterosexuals that will move towards homosexuality. This change in sexuality is even stronger when you consider adolescence. According to the data from a very large US ADD health study, in 16 to 17-year-olds, 98% of homosexuals and bisexuals will move towards heterosexuality. 16-year-olds saying that they are either homosexual or bisexual are at least 25 times more likely to say that they are opposite sex attracted at the age of 17 than heterosexuals are likely to change towards homosexuality. Twin studies also help to debunk the idea of homosexuality having a genetic basis. I mentioned twin studies earlier in the video, but essentially identical twins share 100% of their genes with each other, and studies have shown that identical twins are only 14% and 11% concordant for homosexuality respectively. What this means is that for men, for example, every 9 sets of male identical twins where one twin is homosexual, the other twin is only homosexual 1 out of 9 times, or 11% of the time. If homosexuality was genetic, then it would be expected that homosexuality would be 100% concordant in identical twins, or close to that number. So in any given pair of identical twins where one twin is homosexual, almost all the time the other twin would be homosexual too. But in reality, the opposite ends up being the case. Now, a trait being 11 or 14% genetic is nothing really that special, since all traits are at least 10% genetic, because without any genes you couldn't really have any human behaviour at all. For reference, church attendance is considered 20% genetic, divorce is over 50% genetic, and so is homophobia. That's right folks, being homophobic is more genetic than being homosexual. So the next time you feel like hating on homophobes, remember that they are simply born that way, and you all need to stop being so bigoted towards a characteristic that cannot be changed. Now, the reason why this is for all three of the examples given is that your genes influence personality traits that indirectly make you more likely to adopt these characteristics. For example, divorce is correlated heavily with impulsivity. People getting married too hastily, for example, and impulsivity is influenced by genes. But you would be hard pressed to claim that divorce is innate, that anyone is destined to become a divorcee no matter what, simply because of the genes they were born with. There are all manner of environmental explanations for why a divorce may occur, like bad financial luck, friends not liking your spouse, differences in religion or culture and the conflict that may arise from that, and so on. And that goes too for all of the other characteristics mentioned. It's also argued that if homosexuality isn't caused by genetics, then it's instead caused by the fetus being exposed to hormones in the womb. But this is not supported by any evidence. In situations where feti have experienced abnormal dosages of hormones in the womb, this either has no or at best a very weak effect on the sexuality of that person when they grow older. So what actually are the factors causing homosexuality then, if it's not genetics or prenatal hormones? In short, there isn't one singular reason as to why homosexual tendencies may develop. There are any number of possible events that may be interpreted by an individual in such a way that makes it psychologically impact them such that they become a homosexual. One such example is adverse childhood experiences. In particular, homosexuals compared to heterosexuals are 2.3 times more likely to have been sexually abused, 1.7 times more likely to have been emotionally or physically abused, and 2.4 times more likely to have had someone in their household with a mental illness. They also have higher rates of household substance misuse, household domestic violence, having incarcerated household members, and parental separation or divorce, and the list goes on. And this has been shown time and time again in numerous studies. There are many potential reasons for why these adverse childhood experiences and mistreatment may result in homosexuality. Mistreatment may cause a lower self-worth, feeling different from others, and stigmatization, leading them to then identify with stigmatized groups like homosexuals. Sexual abuse may teach homosexuality in instances of homosexual abuse, or cause aversion to heterosexuality in instances of heterosexual abuse. Maltreatment and stress can cause emotional numbing and disinhibition, and subsequently an increase in novelty seeking and risk taking behaviour, which is associated with homosexuality. Or it can lead to an increase in depression, stress, anger and other negative emotions, which may cause an increased sex drive and desire for intimacy, including homosexual. With the psychological aspect to this, there are any number of possible paths you can go down for how this obviously negative psychologically impacting part of one's life can lead to not just homosexuality but all sorts of different or abnormal behaviours in life. A lack of access to partners of the opposite sex is also another possible cause. In China, for example, there have been studies where in areas with an overabundance of men and a lack of women, homosexuality increases. Such differences in the ratio of men to women arise in places like China due to the one-child policy that they had between 1979 and 2015. People would abort babies that were female until they got a male one, since there was a large preference for having a male baby if that was the only one you were allowed to have, naturally leading of course to more men existing than women. It can be argued as well that this same effect occurs in prisons, where we generally associate prisons with having an increase in homosexuality, as there are of course no opposite sex partners available there either. I also want to go over the evolutionary theories people will bring up to explain why homosexuality isn't antithetical to evolution. It should be stated first that any such theories are automatically invalid due to the strong evidence for homosexuality being environmental and not genetic, but I will cover this regardless. By far the most common theory I have seen about this is something called the gay uncle theory. The idea is that a small number of homosexuals in a population is evolutionary advantageous because it means that they can look after their nieces and nephews in terms of investing more resources and also looking after them in case something were to happen to the parents, since they wouldn't have any kids of their own. The idea is that this makes the nieces and nephews more likely to survive and thrive. The problem with this theory, which is just a theory with zero supporting evidence, is that studies have shown that homosexuals are no more likely to be more generous towards their kin than heterosexuals, and in some instances have been shown to be less generous. If homosexuality exists because it's evolutionary beneficial for increased resources towards their kin, you would expect the opposite to occur, but this is not the case. Furthermore, why would they not simply be asexual rather than homosexual? Investing in a relationship would take away from the energy and resources that could be spent providing for the nieces and nephews. It just does not add up. With regards to evolution and environment, remember as well that just because we evolved for a particular function does not mean that this can't be heavily changed by environment. For example, we evolved to walk upright. We are descendants of Homo erectus, or upright man. In spite of this, however, you have instances of feral children, for example, who were raised in wolf packs or other such unnatural and atypical environments, who will walk on all fours. It's what feels natural for them as it's what they were taught at a young age, and they will struggle for the rest of their lives to walk upright when they enter human society and people attempt to teach them to do so. This does not negate the fact that human beings are meant to walk upright, as it's what we evolved to do. And the same can be said for how heterosexuality, being an innate aspect to human beings which we evolved to have, does not mean that homosexuality can't then be a purely environmental characteristic in contrast. Sexuality being determined by environment rather than being an innate and fixed part of who you are has some important implications. If we can influence sexuality, then for the sake of things like declining birth rates or the negative health effects and its cost associated with homosexuality, then we absolutely should influence it in the opposite direction to what we're doing already. Currently in Western nations, we are heavily promoting and celebrating homosexuality in films, social media, and so on, as discussed in the intro, giving them special status and membership into the League of Victims and all of the privileges that go along with that. This kind of stuff is especially targeted towards younger people whose brains are still developing and, as discussed earlier, have a far more fluid and malleable sexuality. Gen Z is far more likely to identify as non-heterosexual, and while many will grow out of this, others will convince themselves that it's a part of who they are, that to think otherwise would be internalized homophobia, or that they would no longer be a part of the LGBT community or whatever else. Special support and homosexual affirming counselling at school for young people is especially damaging for this reason, as it's currently based on the false premise that it is innate and unchangeable. Undoing all of this so-called progress would objectively be a net benefit to society for this reason. Sexuality being malleable and not innate also provides another strong evolutionary reason for aversion to homosexuality. Someone who is very homophobic would want to keep their children away from homosexuals to prevent those children from then learning homosexual tendencies and then not going on to reproduce. I want to now take the time to go over some of the various criticisms that pro-homosexual advocates have to the points that I've brought up and the common counter-arguments that they tend to bring up. And brace yourself, because some of these are real arguments that I have personally gotten during the making of this video. Hold it! Even if you don't care about the negative physical and mental health consequences that it results in amongst their own, you probably should care about the massive cost in healthcare as well as the threat it poses to birth rates. In Western nations, we have had a birth rate below replacement level for decades, and the rise in homosexuality, which is environmental and is preventable, is certainly not going to help. But even so, I think the best way to demonstrate why this is a flawed idea is with the comparison to other examples of paraphilias like courtrophilia, autosadism, or consensual incest, which I'm going to focus on that last one now. So everyone agrees that incest is disgusting and wrong, in spite of it being an act that's between two consenting adults. Oh, but incest results in genetic disorders for the offspring, I hear you say. But what about homosexual incestuous relationships, or instances where one or both members in the relationship are sterile, either naturally or via vasectomy or hysterectomy? And even if they weren't, they could practice safe sex and get an abortion if a pregnancy did occur. And if it was purely for preventing genetic disorders, then why are those with hereditary genetic disorders allowed to have relationships and get married? If a birthing parent has Down syndrome, for example, then there is a 35 to 50% chance of passing down their condition to their children. You might then say that incest is wrong because of the power imbalance between family members, being a cause for grooming, like with a mother and a son, or an older and younger sibling. Setting aside that this doesn't apply to certain dynamics like two siblings or two cousins of the same age, if there isn't any grooming and they are both consenting adults and started the relationship while both were consenting adults, then what is the problem? A risk of grooming exists in all kinds of various dynamics, like a boss and an employee, a rich person and an old person, or a blind person and a sighted person, landlord and tenant, and so on. It would be silly to then say that it should be banned for these people to have relationships and marry. No, the real reason why incest is socially unacceptable and hated, with incestuous relationships being illegal in most of the Western world, is because it's gross. We've evolved to see it as gross, and we are still allowed to hate it. Incestophiles were simply unsuccessful in advocating to overturn the social taboo against them, while homosexuals were successful in this regard. If you can acknowledge that it's perfectly reasonable to be against incest and the acceptance of incest in society, or any other paraphilia that's between two consenting adults in privacy, simply because we are biologically wired to be put off by it, then it's hypocritical to then be against homophobes for this same reason. Many animals also rape, eat poop, or cannibalize their infants, but that doesn't mean it's normal for humans to do the same thing. It should also be noted that there are no clear examples of exclusive homosexuality where opposite sex partners are available in any wild animal. Take that! I put a list of video topic ideas into a random name generator, and this happened to be the one I got. If simply making a video about something makes you obsessed, then no one would ever make a video about anything lest they be considered obsessed by the topic. Objection! Being against something doesn't mean you are secretly that thing, any more than an environmentalist secretly wants to spread pollution, an arachnophobe wants to have sex with spiders, and a communist is secretly rich and loves money. I think the truth of the matter is that pro-homosexual advocates are secretly really homophobic. All these advocacy organisations, charities, pride parades, and so on are all just codes to cover up their secret raging homophobia. These kinds of slogans and catchphrases are completely hollow and meaningless, since you can apply such a catchphrase to any number of paraphilias if you so choose, but that doesn't make it right. Take that! This is just flat out wrong. It's a myth that ancient Greek and Roman civilizations commonly practiced or were even accepting of homosexuality. For further information on this, I highly recommend these two videos by the Leather Apron Club. But even if it were true, I don't think that just because the Romans or Greeks did something, that it automatically makes doing that thing right. No civilization is perfect. There were many aspects of both these civilizations that I admire, and those that I disagree with. What would you do if someone you knew had any of the other paraphilias I listed previously? Would you find courtrophilia normal because you had a son that was into it? This hypothetical has always made very little sense to me. Specifically brought up as an argument against when people say homosexuals aren't able to reproduce, this is different because they are leaving behind the material world to focus entirely on self-realization and attain some kind of enlightenment or union with God. They have sexual desires, but they choose not to act on them for spiritual purposes. They are exerting discipline and making a sacrifice to not have sex and reproduce. This is in contrast to homosexuals who can't reproduce and are in large part hedonists and are seeking after base physical pleasures. Homosexuals also don't choose to be homosexuals, unlike the choice to take a vow of celibacy. Some monks, nuns and priests may have no sex drive, in which case there is something wrong with them. This condition is called HSDD, and it also kind of defeats the purpose of taking a vow of celibacy in my opinion, but that's beside the point. That some historical figures happen to have this affliction does not mean that homosexuality is therefore normal, since the deeds of these men were not dependent on them being homosexual. The number of great historical figures who were homophobic overwhelmingly outnumbers the number of homosexual great historical figures, as most people throughout history were homophobic. So you can just as well flip this argument on its head and say that homophobia is therefore good and necessary for society for the same reason. There are also many historical figures with various other abnormal sexual paraphilias like incestophilia. This does not mean that incest is therefore good either. I hope this video has taught you something and has made you consider things that you hadn't before, and shown that there is more to this viewpoint than simply mindless hate. At the end of the day, it's up to the individuals, organizations and nations given all this information to make the correct choices in how we act on this information. And as it stands, I think it's clear based on the evidence examined in this video that we are not making the correct choice, not for the well-being of homosexuals or for the well-being of society at large. I do not condone violence or hatred to anyone, and nothing I have said in this video has to imply so. This video is by no means exhaustive. There are many more dimensions to this topic which I did not cover, so I urge you to go and do your own research. All viewpoints on any kind of debate deserve to be given a fair consideration, and whether you agree or disagree with anything I have said in this video, if you at least agree with that sentiment, then please share the video with others, leave a comment down below about your thoughts on this topic or the video itself. This has taken me a really long time to make, and I have more ideas for future videos, so if that interests you then please consider subscribing. That's it from me, have a great rest of your day.